Hello?
Hello.
Can anyone hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can't hear you. Hold
Oh,
on.
And we've got other committee members, so Chair Linwall, if you want to get started, we can.
sure. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
Okay, great. Would you care to call the meeting to order or the quorum? I guess it's quorum first, right?
Yes. Hold on a second. Commissioner Isaac. Got his sound here.
Oh, he's muted.
he's muted.
No, he's not.
Go to Commissioner Westerberg
Yes,
and Chair Linwall.
Yes.
Okay, we do have a quorum.
Okay. I think next we need a motion to suspend the rules to conduct the meeting electronically.
I so move.
Second. Whoop, Peter seems to be muted, so I'll second,
Okay.
I guess.
I'm back. I'm sorry. I couldn't hear anything.
Okay.
Okay, so you will say Commissioner Isaac seconded that one.
All right, that's better. You're suspending the rules, Peter.
All right, done.
All right, Commissioner Isaac,
Yeah, aye.
Commissioner Westerberg,
Aye.
Chair Linwall.
Aye.
Passes.
Okay, next we need a motion to approve the meeting minutes from November 11th of the zoning committee.
Motion to approve. Although I was absent.
I motion to approve.
Thank you.
I guess I'll second.
Okay. Commissioner Isaac,
I'll abstain.
Commissioner Westerberg,
Approved.
Chair Linwall.
Aye.
All right, that passes.
Okay, next up is continued discussion on a text amendment relating to the occupancy of dwelling units. This item was originally discussed at the November 11th commission meeting. I believe that was the date.
Yes.
And I believe Megan, you and staff have a presentation to get us started. Or at least
Yes,
at least
yeah,
the beginning of a
brief
discussion.
overview. Hold on for a second. All right, is everyone able to see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, as Chair Linwall mentioned, this discussion for occupancy of dwelling units and the definition of family started at the November 11th Plan Commission meeting. This actually came about from a aldermanic referral from, I believe it was Alderman Wilson, to the Plan Commission to discuss modifications to the zoning ordinance for the occupancy of dwelling units and looking into the definition of family. The initial staff recommendations that came about or that were in that initial memo included exploring the use of occupancy standards from the Building or Property Maintenance Code for owner-occupied and rental dwellings, consideration of an option to limit the maximum occupancy of all dwelling units regardless of size to no more than 8 occupants, whether related or unrelated. And any dwelling proposed for more than those 8 occupants would be able to apply for a special use as a rooming house. And we would then have to make sure rooming houses would be available as a special use in all of the residential districts, because as of now, they are not. And then finally, consideration of eliminating any reference to family in the zoning regulations for the occupancy of dwelling units and in the entire zoning ordinance. So At that November Plan Commission meeting, some of the following discussion points were considered regarding the family definition, removing the servant wording within the definition, replacing it with live-in employee or something similar, and then allow any dwelling unit to have a guest or a live-in employee regardless of the dwelling size. I think right now it mentions at least 1,000 feet. We'd also incorporate foster family situations into the family definition, a removal of married in that definition, and then consideration of protected classes. I think the example that was given during that discussion was like sober houses. Also discussed applying the occupancy rules across both owner, occupied, and rental units. And in that we, as I mentioned, talked about using square footage as a basis for that. There was some concern that that may lead to too dense an occupancy. Then also determination of when maximum occupancy for a dwelling would be determined if we were referring to an owner-occupied home. Of course, with these proposed new regulations, there is the question of how we would enforce those regulations and how we would even enforce the existing regulations, as well as deal with student nuisances. We mentioned possible creation of operating agreements with landlords that address occupancy and other items that may create nuisances, and then having fines if that agreement is not followed. Enforcement of existing nuisance ordinances. And we would definitely need additional staff and property standards to maintain the occupancy records and conduct inspections, and spot checks would end up occurring as well. And then finally, how will these regulations address home additions that may be constructed? People are constantly doing additions or renovations to their homes. So size limitations actually already exist through building lot coverage regulations. An additional occupancy review may still be needed depending on what an addition may include. So just as a reference, this is the current definition of family. It's pretty lengthy, as you can see, but still doesn't fully take into account many of the changing dynamics that people have in their families today. We can refer back to this as the discussion continues. And these are the existing dwelling unit occupancy regulations, as in Title VI. I think we may have addressed these already. There was some discussion about some additional information. So did include some maps that were actually a part of a white paper that was done in, I believe, 2017. And this is from our Housing and Grants division. We have the owner rental housing breakdown here, affordable rental housing, and then income restricted rental units. And so if there's any of this information that you want to refer to as we continue the discussion this evening, we can definitely go back to these. But we do want to try to revisit some of the major talking points that were brought up at the November meeting and try to get a little bit more discussion done with that. And then maybe some possible talking points or regulations that we may be able to include and bring back to the full commission in the future. So with that, I'll take any questions. We do have a couple of people who signed up to speak, but it looks like we have a number of people who may also want to speak as well.
Okay, so commissioners, let's start with Commissioner Isaac or Westerberg.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see like the entire concept of having these definitions in the zoning ordinance is I feel like it's problematic, and I guess I I want someone to explain the, the reason for continuing to have these regulations in the zoning. Like, I guess it's a question for Megan. Like, is there, do all municipalities have a definition of family and tie it to occupancy?
Not every municipality has the same kind of definition that we have. There are some municipalities that have a fairly lengthy definition. There are others who have definitely simplified their definition and are essentially using like a housekeeping unit or something that's very simplified and doesn't speak to like a nuclear family or something that gets very specific like that. There are regulations that do tie that family definition into the occupancy and do something similar. There are some places that are trying to do away with that or just think outside of the box when it comes to that.
I guess is like, how does this tie into, let's say, building code regulations, right? And like life safety issues as it relates to, as it relates to occupancy, right? So like, when there's a restaurant that opens, it gets an occupancy placard based on its size, right? And that's all based on life safety, not the size of the place, not the definition or of the relationship of the people inside the building. And so I guess I'm wondering, do places that don't define family in their zoning ordinance, do they regulate it in some other way by addressing it in their building code and have, like a maximum occupancy per square foot or something to that effect?
There are some places that do that. I mean, it is interesting that you bring that up because that is something that we are trying to consider. And I think within the memo, we had Chicago in there and they go based off of, and I think they may have actually changed some of their regulations based off of the square footage. And we could do something similar if it gets to the point where we're not doing things based off of that lengthy family definition. We do have staff that may be able to speak further to some of the specifics, but we could do something that is based off of the square footage of like the bedrooms and common space such as living rooms or dining rooms and do it that way and have a maximum occupancy based off of that.
So I guess
Relationships.
I think a great starting point would be where, like, why do we even want the definition in there to begin with, right? So like, what are we trying to what are we trying to regulate? What are we trying to prevent, right? Like, the only reason to have this in there is because we want to prevent something. And if it's as simple as we don't want 20 college kids or what, or 20 people living in a 4-bedroom apartment, well then I think that may just be more like, that may not be in the purview of the plan commission. Maybe that's just a rental regulations that you can't have. You can't rent. A rental unit can't be occupied by more than 2 people per bedroom, right? Something to that effect. If that's really what we're going after, right? And then you run into the issue of like, well, you're treating rentals different than homeowners, right? And so why should they be treated differently because of their the form of of residency. It's not, I don't know. I don't know. Just, I'm talking too much now.
No, so Commissioner, this is Judy Friedland from the Law Department, and
Yep.
all the issues that you raised are right on point for everything that I think we've discussed and gone through. And I think that the reason that Evanston wants to get away from the family definition is a very positive reason. And also, the good thing about the Evanston Building Code is that the occupancy calculations for residences is very good, and it's very clear, and it's very safety oriented. And that's how I think the city or some of the planners would like to go in that direction. For example, I think in Chicago, it's just based on a square footage for each unit. And so you could crowd a lot of people in there. The good thing about the Evanston Building Code, and I believe that Ms. Schnorr from the Property Standards is on this call, and she can correct me if I'm wrong. But so with Evanston, it's based on the size of the bedroom. So each bedroom I think is 70 square feet, or if it's 2 people, it would be 50 square feet per each and a 100 square foot bedroom. And then there's a calculation for living room and dining room. So there's a very, solid way to calculate occupancy based on safety standards and enough room in the apartment. And so I think that that's the way that I think a lot of people would like to go, is just base it on safety. Like you say, there'd be an occupancy for each unit. And then if you get to a home or a property where it would be 8 people or more, then they would have to go get a special use. But the family definition would go away. It would go based on safety. And I think if, Ms. Flax and others are on the call that can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's kind of the direction, exactly the things that you were saying is the direction that we're thinking would be, a better way of implementing zoning.
I've got a question with regard, to the number of, several things. First of all, would you not have to figure out what the maximum occupancy would be for every unit in Evanston? And there are 28,000 of them roughly. There are 28,000 households. So how would you go about enforcing this?
One of the ways we already started doing this when we allowed rental of coach houses is in order to get their rental registration approved, which all rental units have to do. They have to give a floor plan, and it doesn't have to be professionally drawn necessarily. It can be hand drawn as long as the dimensions are there, so that Angel Schnorr and her team can calculate the maximum occupancy based on how the dwelling unit is actually constructed. And even though there are a lot of dwelling units, quite a few of them, especially when you get into multifamily, they tend to have certain floor plans for floor. So it's not like you have to calculate every single one of them. And in fact, when we get as new buildings are constructed, this ought to be determined right at the time by looking at them based on their floor plans, so they know it up front. So it would be done at construction. And we've talked about with units that are for sale, as properties are sold, that would be done as they are being sold. So there'd be kind of rolling basis.
What happens if, especially with the for sale ones, where you have a family that may, for whatever reason, have 8 kids? So you automatically would violate, the maximum of 8 people in a dwelling unit. And, and I don't see that you'd want them to go get a rooming house license.
No.
I mean, I think there's, just bringing this to the logical conclusion just kind of raises lots of questions for me in terms of trying to enforce this.
Well, there does have, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Commissioner Lindwall, I would say that if you were comparing how the families, the definition of families and the regulations were involving those, involving the family definition, I don't think they're very much enforced, right? Unless there's a complaint and property standards shows up and says, hey, it looks like there's 10 people living here. What's the deal? Who are these people? And, and like, let's see your lease. Who's on the lease? Who's supposed to be here? I mean, this would be a lot simpler. And in fact, what Miss Flax was saying about the, getting that information into property standards and getting it into their database. I think that's definitely a step above what we already have, because now property standards can walk in and they're looking at their their iPad as they're walking in. They're like, okay, well, there should only be 7 people living in this place at most, and so and once they have that information, it's not like owner the property owner has to do that floor plan every year.
Yeah, but yeah,
Right.
I understand once you get everything in the system. But the other question that I've got is how many, what's been the experience in the last, say, two years with respect to violations of the occupancy based on the family definition? What kind of data do we have? Is there really a need to change?
One of the things, let me, if I can, have Angel Schnur, who handles all of our property standards issues, answer some of that. But one of the things that tends to happen is I believe fewer than 5% of our complaint inspections are generated based on occupancy. I think that was what Angel had said at one point. So really, one of the things is, in most cases, the issues we are trying to control using our occupancy standards have nothing to do with occupancy. They really have to do with behavior, like there's garbage, or there are too many cars, or there are all kinds of things that are triggered. So we're trying to control certain things with a device that doesn't control it at all. And so we would continue if somebody obviously has a complaint and says that there are too many people living there. We could then look at the occupancy standards and at least be able to determine if they are over occupancy. Because I mean, what makes a family of 15 in a property okay, but rental of 15 of different people not okay? They're both over occupancy for health and safety. I mean, what I'm saying is, if you had overcrowding, and then a real issue becomes, what are the complaints being generated for, that we're then ending up looking at occupancy as the way of solving it. If there's too much garbage and we see there's one more person, is it really we can solve that? I mean, if it were over the family definition, you can solve the problem of garbage by having an extra garbage can required or something like that. So what are we really trying to address is what I'm saying. And I think that we have cases like at the university area where landlords do not even put all the people on the lease who they're officially leasing to. And what happens then, and our students have come out and told us this, that the landlords then say, if you call about any complaints on the property, then we'll have to throw you out because we're over occupancy. So it can work to the disadvantage of ways of housing people. Now, the houses of students that are out of control can be controlled by other mechanisms, which is the nuisance property and behavioral things, because there's really nothing that says a familial relationship by number controls behavior. And zoning really shouldn't be trying to control the relationship of people living in housing units, especially not based on definitions from times when those were largely used to exclude certain types of households.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm with our expanded definition. I'm not sure who we're excluding other than more than 3 unrelated. I mean, I'm not sure that the definition is written, really, I'm trying to figure out which groups we're not allowing within our definition, other than, I think the type D could be rewritten so you can get the 7 retired nuns or the 5 Buddhist priests, or monks. But I'm, because you're on the A definition, you're related by, some sort of kind of traditional marriage relationship. Type B handles all the other people who want to live together without the benefit of marriage. So I'm not sure, other than, kind of some sort of making sure that some sort of guardianship relationship is included in those two. I'm not sure who we're leaving out. So in part, I'm kind of, at a loss to see who we're missing.
Well, one of the things that you do run into is if I am a inspector and I come in and I can observe how many people are there. I don't know how I am going to confirm anybody's familial relationships without getting into an awful lot of personal information. And quite honestly, I don't think it's any of our business. I mean, somebody can say they're married. What do you do with a couple who are not officially married, who have children but aren't, and somebody else living there and who isn't, who is unrelated in any way? I mean, if that couple isn't officially married, do you deny them? If they don't have a marriage license, are we going to ask them for a marriage license?
No.
I mean, I just don't think that there's
No,
way we can enforce it on that.
I don't think you need to. And the extra person, we allow, in addition to the family, you allow an additional 2 unrelated people as, boarders and live-in employees. And, so I think there's a lot of flexibility with the definition. It could probably be even simplified and just make it a, housekeeping unit. But I guess I look at the definition of family as a kind of a policy issue that's describing that for each dwelling unit, you want to basically have one household that's defined, kind of as a family or 3 unrelated people. And I guess the question, that it goes kind of back to the enforcement issue. Are landlords, I presume that landlords have, the definition. So do all landlords know what the definition of a family is? I mean, I don't know that changing the zoning ordinance to address landlords who want to skirt the rules is the answer either.
Oh, well, I wasn't trying to say that that's what we're trying to do.
No,
I just don't think that the familial relationship among the people living in the dwelling unit really has anything to do with health and safety, which is what I think that we're trying to control by occupancy.
So Sarah, just a question. When you look at the type C family definition, it just says a group of not more than 3 unrelated persons. Type B has 2 unrelated persons and their children. So, it's taking the term family and saying, okay, for this group, it's defined as this, it's defined as this. It does seem to have some flexibility. I mean, I'm not opposed to changing some of the very outdated terms like servant or one another, but it seems to me that right now the definition allows for flexibility in how you actually define these groups of people. Is the concern more that we should allow for 4 unrelated persons? Is it the number of people that people are concerned about, or what?
I believe that the zoning of this type and this kind of language has historically been put into place to prevent any kind of households that aren't really very, quote, traditional middle and upper middle class households. Because when you think about it, we have houses and even some apartments that may have more than 3 bedrooms, for example. So right now, if we have 4 adults, and they wanted to live together in a 5-bedroom house that had plenty of common space based on the square footage that we've talked about, that technically would not be allowed by this. And we could continue to create different family versions to accommodate everything, but to what point? I don't understand what we're doing with that family definition that addresses health and safety that we can't just address by saying, let's look at the size of the bedrooms, to determine how much sleeping area they have, and then the size of the common area to make sure that that matches that fits. So you can't have somebody try to turn an entire property into bedrooms so that they can cram 9 million people in it. So, and in the definition, Angel, correct me if I'm wrong on this. For example, you can't define a room that somebody would have to go through to get to another room as a bedroom. That does not meet the definition of bedroom. So somebody couldn't turn a room that is really designed to be a common area. I mean, I'm thinking of, just the way a lot of dwelling units are built. So there are really quite a lot of safety things to keep people from just cramming more people in there. But I don't understand what the benefit of having a definition of family is. And, the attachment really talks about the challenges of it both ways. I agree with Judy that if we just use square footage, that can get people into a lot of trouble. I mean, that can get municipalities into a lot of trouble, because if you just take all the non-kitchen and non-bathroom square footage and divided it up and said X number of square feet per person, you could have some really, really dense occupancy standards that I don't think would really be particularly good for health and safety. So, but I guess I don't understand the value of trying to continue to define versions of family. We have 4-bedroom apartments. You can't have 4 single adults that aren't related in them legally right now.
No, but you could have 2 grad students with their kids or some other, I mean, they're again.
Well, yes, but I mean, every time you come up with a different type, and let's face it, the way people are living is changing a lot. And I think that we're really just I just don't see the benefit of trying to define all those when we can control the occupancy by square footage in the way that the apartment or house is, physically configured.
I think I'd like to go back to a discussion, which this all kind of goes to enforcement. And right now we have landlords who, clearly know the rules, and, especially with students, but I think that, it goes to other people. I can remember Alderman Rainey describing how in her ward, there were situations when an inspection was happening, the movers would come and move the extra beds into a moving truck and drive them around the city for a day. So this isn't just, I guess that would be with 2 questions. Is this an issue that's confined to one part of the city? And, what happens to the landlords now that are choosing, to lease to more than three students, or they're not following the rules now? How would changing the definition make them any more likely to follow new rules?
Well, if you have a rule that all people should be on the lease, and you don't have a rule that would say you can't have this configuration of people because of a familial relationship, I think you're less likely to have people not putting who is on the lease on the lease. Are there going to be some landlords that are going to violate the rules? I gotta say, there's no way we can keep that from happening, but it is much easier for a property standards inspection or anybody else to count the number of people on the lease and the number of people that are supposed to be allowed in that, based on the size and configuration of the unit, to be able to determine if they are over their occupancy and if they are indeed dealing with who's on the lease. Now, obviously, there can be things like people can have visitors. So you're always going to have some situations where you may have somebody who is there but not on the lease and things like that. There's no one thing that will solve anything, but having a definition of family doesn't solve those things either. So the question is, why have it if it's just one more thing that complicates it and could provide situations where people, I don't think we could possibly come up with a definition that could include everybody, or every potential family situation, that could, or household situation that could come up. And as I say, I just don't understand the point of it.
Well, I guess I kind of want to go back. Now, we have occupancy standards now, right? In terms of square footage in the building code?
Well, we have them in our property standards code is what we are using when we look at rentals. Now, we don't apply anything to ownership ordinarily. So we have this, there's nothing that says R3 unrelated or anything doesn't apply to that either, but we don't have any inspection process or any way of currently that we pay any attention to it. The only thing that happens is if there's a complaint of overcrowding or something, then we have to respond to that. And there have been some instances where there have been places that have been overcrowding, and property standards and our law department collectively have dealt with them. And maybe it would be good if Angel were to describe how some of that was being handled. Would that be useful?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Property standards receives complaints for over occupancy. Most of the time it's in a rental property. Occasionally it will be in an owner occupied unit, or maybe they have a coach house that's rented. But the difficulty in enforcing the over occupancy is that the people who know about the requirements of family and have people who are not family living with them to share expenses will go to great lengths to remove beds, remove personal items. And so it becomes difficult for the inspector to see that the property is overoccupied to even enforce anything. Now we can see that there's garbage and we can address that. We can see that there's, furniture strewn about the property and we can address that. But if we can't see the overoccupancy, we don't have the opportunity to address it. And many landlords and tenants both who know about these specific requirements as they relate to the definition of family will have the tenants move the belongings when they know we're coming, because we have to give notice for an inspection. We can't just show up on the door and knock on the door and say, let us in. So there isn't the element of surprise to find out that it's overoccupied. And that makes it incredibly difficult for us to enforce. But also the tenants then don't feel like they can contact us if there is a problem, because they know that we're going to come and potentially see that there's 5 or 6 people living in this rather large home with 4, 5, 6 bedrooms, but they're not related by family, and they know that that's a violation of the code. We have found in the last year a couple of properties that we were able to identify as being overoccupied, and we worked out an agreement with the landlords and had it filed in administrative hearings that they weren't going to overoccupy at the termination of their current lease, and that if they were overoccupied, then they would be fined. And the fines could grow based on how many times they were found liable for the same situation. But they signed the agreement because they know that, what they're doing is wrong and they were caught basically. But these are large homes that they're occupying. And there's definitely room for more than 3 people when you consider life safety requirements.
To Angel's point, one of the properties that she's referring to, it is coming into compliance. And the way that it's doing that is not by reducing its occupancy. It's doing it by adding an internal dwelling unit. So by adding one kitchen and one door, now they comply, even though it's the same size structure.
Okay. I think that, you know, kind of the other thing that I find a bit troubling, and again, it doesn't have anything to do really with the occupancy and the enforcement of standards, is in the area around the university, and I, you know, kind of live pretty close to campus. There are situations where landlords have, you know, decided that, you know, for a single family house, they're going to charge, you know, $6,000 or $7,000 a month in rent, which, frankly, I mean, that at 30% of median income, we're talking, you'd have to have a household income of about, you know, 240,000 for that to be affordable. And what they've been doing, again, these are landlords who clearly, you know, don't mind violating the rules and you know, leasing to 6 or 7 students who find it, you know, pretty affordable at $1,000 a month or a few $100s a month, whatever however many people they put in there. So I'm a little concerned about, you know, the issue of upsetting the normal, you know, rental market dynamics as well. And, you know, that's clearly not something that can, you know, and it's not an occupancy enforcement issue, but it does go to kind of policy and what we want our neighborhoods to be. So I think that would be my argument for maintaining the family definition, is it really kind of is describing what our respective neighborhoods should look like. And, you know, and again, you know, and if I recall correctly, Commissioner Isaac, when we were discussing the accessory dwelling units, didn't you make a specific point that we ought to be, the occupants ought to be families? Or am I misremembering?
Let's see, with respect to, there was something about families in,
I mean, you didn't want 5 or 6 unrelated people in a accessory dwelling unit, did you?
I think I went for that and a couple of others.
well, I believe, I mean, number one, an accessory dwelling unit, I think we've said that it can't be more than 1,000 square feet.
Right.
So it's not gonna have more than, you know, 3 or 4 people at most.
The size of that would preclude much of what I think you're worried about there in terms of
Yeah.
unrelated people living there, no matter what, just based.
I'm sorry, Commissioner Linwell. I don't recall.
Okay. Well, I could be misremembering as well. But I mean, you know, I like the notion of having a definition of family to describe really who should be living in a dwelling unit.
Okay, let me like play with that for a second, because you can have a family living in a 5-bedroom house, and they have a you know, it's a couple and 2 children, and the 2 children each have a bedroom, and they have an extra bedroom and they want to rent it.
Yep.
Okay. Where does that fall into this? Where would that fall into this definition?
You can have, in addition to the family, you can have 2 additional boarders, servants, whatever, nanny, friend. So yeah. So if you've got let's say you've got a senior who's got a big, you know, widow, you know, who's got a big house, and she doesn't, you know, she wants somebody to share her expenses. Right now, with the definitions, you can have 2 additional people.
Where I don't see that. Where is that?
I think maybe it goes under the occupancy, does it not? to next slide.
Well, one of the things we find is it's really hard to even figure out our current code and how it actually applies to certain households or situations. So that in itself speaks to difficulty in enforcement and just a lot of time trying to figure those things out.
Let's see. No dwelling unit shall contain less than.
It's the B part.
Okay, so no dwelling unit contains less than 1,000 square feet of floor area shall be used to provide living quarters for roomers. Okay. Not more than 2 servants, roomers, or permanent guests.
In this case, though, if they are renting out that space, it's not technically a guest. If they're
Well,
paying,
but it would be a roomer. It's a roomer.
Yeah.
And that's where I had suggested we ought to get rid of that 1,000 square feet limitation, because I think we want to make sure that, you know, you can have a live-in caregiver in any size rental, a rental apartment. It's less than 1,000 square feet. I don't want to preclude that.
Commissioner Linwell, let me ask you, like, if there's more than one way to skin this cat, why, like, what's the benefit of having the definition of family?
I think that it really kind of goes back to policy in terms of, if you look at our comprehensive plan and we're describing what a neighborhood should be of, you know, it's multifamily or single family or two family. It really kind of is describing what the, you know, the construct of a neighborhood is. And I, you know, that's kind of why I think that the family or household, or however you want to define it, I think that that's an important kind of contextual piece. You know, the whole enforcement issue is something else. It gets to, you know, how do you address the, you know, it's in particular the landlords who are not going to follow whatever rules are, you know, are in place. I mean, I know, you know, I don't know if legally or illegally, but I know that the first, probably 10 or 15 years ago now, the first apartment I lived in Evanston was a 2-bedroom apartment across the street from the Civic Center. And lo and behold, the owner decided to take that 2-bedroom apartment and I think illegally converted into a 3-bedroom one. You know, you know why, I'm not quite sure, but, you know, but those sorts of situations, the city's going to always have to deal with, and it will also often be outside of you know, the rules, or they'll just do that. And I think that if we're talking about enforcement of overcrowding, you know, I'm not sure that the zoning ordinance is the best place to be addressing it to begin with, but I think there's value of having a definition, and I think there's value in having you know, some rule on, you know, how many unrelated people can live together, especially that's a sensitive issue, especially in the area around the campus.
But I think that's the, like, that's the piece, that last part about, you know, should we rethink whether it's important to I guess insist on residences being, you know, or residency being sort of tied to this, to our definition of what a family is, right? A single family is one legal dwelling unit. A multifamily is multiple legal dwelling units, whether they're, you know, they're quote unquote families, or how those families, or, you know, those dwellings are constituted with the people inside them. I think I'm on the fence. I'm on the side of the fence where I don't know that it makes sense to continue legislating that. I mean, I agree with you that an enforcement. I mean, this is with anything, right? Like, no matter what rule you put down, there's always going to be someone or some people that are going to try to skirt those rules. And so enforcement's always an issue. If there's a 30-mile-per-hour speed limit and everyone's going 35, okay, let's make the speed limit 35. Well, guess what? Now there's going to be people that are going to go 40 just because, right? So enforcement's always going to be an issue. But our definitions and what we say is, is what we say about how people should live inside their dwellings. It says something about us, and I think it's time to get rid of the entire definition of family and just go strictly by occupancy. That's just sort of where my head's at on that.
Okay. Commissioner Westerberg, what are your thoughts on this little exchange?
Well, I do think the various definitions of family are pretty broad in the current zoning and should be able to embrace any number of arrangements. But I do understand that you're taking the term family and twisting it a bit each time to try to keep up with changes culturally. I don't know how you deal with that other than just getting rid of any kind of consideration of the relationships. But, again, that's where you go up against history and the idea that a town like Evanston is very much based on the idea of relationships, families, and always has been. So I think one question I have is just if you take out the whole consideration of family, what would you lose by changing that language completely? Would it have any effect? And if not, maybe it's not an issue, but would it have an effect in terms of how the community feels about zoning or about how dwellings are set up? I feel like I can, these definitions, while maybe somewhat torturous at times, aren't the real issue. The real issue is how do you enforce things? But if the definition becomes a problem in terms of enforcing things or in terms of legal action, then you do have to consider it. I guess the question is, what do you lose by changing the term family or just omitting it?
I don't think anybody's going to change their family structure if we change the definition of our zoning. I think family structures and household structures are going to continue to evolve, and they always have. And quite frankly, when you look back at the Depression and periods like that, people had all kinds of complex households before we'd applied any of these things over the, added this type of zoning. And much of it was to make sure that people could be safely housed and not be on the street. So, I mean, I guess I just don't believe that the definition of our zoning is going to affect how people choose to manage their living arrangements in a negative way. It's
no,
not like somebody's going to.
But my question is, if at one time this was important, these definitions were important, what would change now, or what would we lose anything by changing the language? That's really my question.
I don't think so. So I think we'd actually gain quite a bit. One of the things that these sorts of definitions have been used for is to exclude certain types of households that were typical of immigrant families and lower income families. And because when you have these family definitions, you say somebody's related by blood, marriage, or adoption. I mean, what level of blood relationship? We never really state that. So and you see different types of in different cultures, you have much broader family groups. And in others, it's very much the nuclear family, parents and children, and that's about it. But I don't see any way of effectively defining all these things in any way that really accomplishes anything positive at all.
Yes, I keep going back to, the question of why is this definition, is it an issue, and has it been a hindrance to our enforcement? I mean, I could see very easily just combining type A and type B, because, I don't care if they're married, if they're living as a household and they're a family, and, if they have a couple of extra boarders, that's, roomers or friends that are part of the family group. And again, the type D family I know was written specifically for Reba Fellowship. And it seems to me there may be some way of kind of broadening that, if, to deal with the, 5 retired nuns, or, whatever, some other kind of group, because I don't know that we'd want them to have to go through getting a group home license or some of the other stuff. So I guess the question for me is, what, what, again, what are we trying to enforce? And would, just going strictly, I mean, it sounds like you're pretty much going strictly by, whatever the property standards code requirements are now. And I don't know that you'd solve the problem of the landlord who decides to rent to as many, students as he can fit in the place. Or, or if it's any other kind of, group that the landlord can, cram into the same, I'm just not sure that eliminating the definition is going to change the enforcement issues that we have. So I'd kind of like to understand how that might work.
This is Judy Friedland from Law. I think, and I've been working on these cases with Angel, where we've called the owners of these properties, where they're really only allowed to have 3, and they may have 4 or 5. And the issue is that there is no building code or safety issue that we're telling them that you can't have more than 3 people. We're saying that it's based on a code and a definition. It's hard, I mean, what do you say? You have to move somebody out and you're going to go in front of a judge and they're going to say, well, they have their own bedroom, there's plenty of space. So when you're looking at overcrowding based on zoning and not because of public safety, these cases are very difficult to prosecute. Maybe Angel can chime in on her thoughts, because she's the one that has to go to administrative hearings and deal with these issues. Because if you have a 4 or 5 bedroom home and you can only allow rent to 3, you're going to a judge. But if you had a family in there, they could have however many children they had. It's just kind of, am I articulating that right, Angel? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, it is difficult especially when we talk about trying to be to equally enforce across the board, whether it's rental or single or a family, by definition of family. You could have a nice, beautiful big house in Evanston that, 5 or 6 friends are trying to rent and share and live together and spend their time together. And they're trying to share expenses, but they can't, because you can only have 3 unrelated, you can have no more than 3 unrelated people. But you can still have the same family with an occupant load in this apartment of 12, and they could move in, and it's really no different than the 5 or 6 people that want to live together. I mean, by doing the definition of family, the definition of family isn't solving the problems that we're trying to address, in my opinion. The problems that we're trying to address are the garbage, the parties, the gathering outside, the loud music. Those are the things that I think that the majority of, in my opinion, our over occupancy complaints come in as. And that doesn't solve anything by the definition of family, because when I go to do an inspection, they've moved a bed or they only have 3 people on the lease. And so I can't change anything with that. But if we're really telling people that, you know, we want to help you with, you know, yes, you can live together and this property is big enough, and let's address the issue that you're really complaining about, that we can do. I can do that with codes already on the books. And I don't have to delve into the definition of family. I don't have to ask anybody if you're related to the person that's sleeping in the room next to you. Is the property big enough and safe enough to support the people that are living in there? And our property maintenance code by square footage addresses that.
Okay.
It sounds to me like there's two things there. That number one, that city staff is being asked to enforce rules that you know, based on, you know, what they see on the ground doesn't make any sense. So the enforcement issue is that, you know, that they're asking whether they should even be enforcing, whether this is a rule worth being enforced. But since it's on the books, they have no choice but to enforce it. So if there's a complaint, they have to do something about it. But you know, behind the scenes, they're looking at it and saying, well, this doesn't make any sense. We don't want to be enforcing this because it doesn't make any sense. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's coming to us.
I would agree. Yes, it's very difficult to enforce based on the definition of family. Not one of my inspectors wants to go into a unit and ask who is related to who. If the property is big enough, quite frankly, it seems to be irrelevant. If it's big enough and safe enough, and it has the bathrooms and it has the kitchen space and the living space to house 5 or 6 people, that should be what we're looking at. When we talk about the safety of our neighborhoods and the safety of our homes, it's irrelevant whether they're related by blood or not, or marriage.
So that's one half of it. And I think the other half is that there is a you know, there is a subset of our society, whether it's on campus where there's, you know, 4-bedroom houses or 4-bedroom apartments that currently can't be fully occupied because of the way families being defined, or, you know, elsewhere within the city where you know, people looking to live in, we'll say, non-traditional arrangements are just simply unable to do so because of the definition of family. So then that's I think the other half of it. I don't have anything else to say. I just wanted to sort of frame that based on what I heard.
I agree. That's part of it. Yes. And Evanston, as beautiful as it is unreachable for so many people because of financial reasons, and they can't share these big homes. They can't share these nicer neighborhoods. They can't move in together because of our definition of family.
Except for the fact that, you know, what we've got, you know, at least in this neighborhood, you've got a situation where the owners of these bigger houses, you know, the landlords of these bigger houses, they're absentee, are not keeping their, you know, we can't do rent control, but I mean, they're certainly not maintaining the rent levels at something that a family, for example, could afford. So there's this other kind of equity issue that is again, it's a policy issue. It's not really, you know, so much related to, you know, the zoning, because we certainly don't, you know, regulate the price of what a house is, other than the fact that some lots are bigger than others and some houses are bigger than others.
Right. But yeah, oh, I'm sorry. But in the people that we've called and in these landlord situations, sometimes we've asked them to provide more garbage cans, to post notes about, you know, keeping quiet for their neighbors, reminding them that they have to be a good neighbor. And I think we've been very successful on all our phone calls and working with people. We can also do other things like riders to leases and so forth to make sure that that people follow the rules. If somebody does go in for a special use for more than 8, you could do a plan of operation where you require a certain amount of garbage pickup. You might, we had one residence by Northwestern where we asked that they do garbage pickup, I think twice a week as opposed to once a week, because everybody was getting packages during the pandemic and the garbage was piling up. So there are ways to work with these type of housing situations so that they are good neighbors. It's just very challenging to say to, for people who maybe want to buy a house in Evanston and fix it up and resell it, well, only 3 of you can do it. The 4th can't, and also you get these larger homes. And I understand the neighbors' concerns. They don't want a frat house next door. And that's a very legitimate concern. And I think that there are ways that we can deal with that. It is a complicated issue. And I totally, understand where you're coming from, but I think we just have to ponder this a little bit, maybe in a different way, to understand that the challenges that it poses for enforcement and also for, just housing in general is something we just need to think about and look at a little bit differently.
Yeah, my concern really is that by just leaving it to occupancy or size of the units, that essentially what you're doing is you've got the potential of pricing just normal families, however they're defined, out of particular neighborhoods, especially close to campus. I mean, one of the things that there was a article that was included in the November packet that really kind of spoke to the economics, and again, that's something that where you have larger houses, particularly close to campus, and you don't have the occupancy limit, you then make it more likely that investor landlords are going to buy up these houses and make lots of money renting to big groups of students, even if they're wonderful neighbors. It's changing the economics and the dynamics of what has been a regular neighborhood. And so, and that has nothing to do with, enforcing occupancy standards, but it does have a lot to do with maintaining, the kind of the quality of a neighborhood, the affordability, keeps it a neighborhood, which goes to the comprehensive plan, and frankly, kind of why you have a zoning ordinance in the first place, is to, maintain property value. It gets into, I know it's all health and safety, but we get into the maintaining, kind of cohesive neighborhoods. And I think that Evanston neighborhoods are pretty diverse. And, so I think that's a reason to have, to really think before you start eliminating, at least the 3 unrelated. And again, I think that getting into, whether or not they're related by, blood or marriage, I don't really, I don't really care, but I do care about making sure that we're preserving neighborhoods and not.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's my feeling on that.
I would question, I don't know what you are thinking about in terms of affordability, but those very large houses that you're talking about, even if they're sold as a single family home, are going upwards of $1 million. I don't see how that has done anything to maintain affordability. In fact, being able to divide them into condos or something like they did with the old Hill House, that was how they subdivided it was actually, and that didn't even make that affordable. I mean, part of the reality is those are very large houses in a very desirable area, and that they're simply not going to be affordable to normal families, at least what I think of as normal. I certainly couldn't go buy them, and many other people can. I don't see how you're going to maintain affordability through that.
But you can have families. If your goal is to create a neighborhood with families, what happens is, the landlords that are, renting these things out at, buying them so they can rent them out at $6,000, $7,000, or $8,000 are, they're essentially, they can outbid other potential family buyers, because they can rent to as, many students as will, fit with the occupancy standards. And at least in the area around the university, that's an issue. And I would imagine that there will be other areas that are desirable for one reason or another. And I think we ought to be, thinking very carefully about that. And again, affordability is 30% of your household income. So while those larger houses, you have to have more income, obviously, to afford them. But there's no reason, and even under our current definition, that you couldn't have intergenerational extended family buy one of those houses.
If I could interject, I think we do have members from the public who
Okay.
to speak.
Well, then I think
Maybe
we
get
can-
some other stakeholder opinions
Sure.
on what's being discussed. I think Sue Lowbach was signed up. Who wants to speak?
Yes, I am. Thank you. I'm Sue Lowbach. I work at Connections for the Homeless and represent a group called Joining Forces for Affordable Housing. And I feel like one of the pieces that's missing from this conversation is some of the damage that this ordinance is doing right now. There's been some discussion about what kinds of neighborhoods we want to create. And I would really question who the we is in that statement. We have many, many people in Evanston, like over about half the population, that are paying more than 30% of their income on housing. And particularly with the pandemic, many of those households are having to resort to alternative ways of living. We have many families that are doubled up, living with other families, probably illegally. We have Connections for the Homeless runs a youth residential program. We have a building that is technically a 2-flat, but has plenty of room for well over probably 8 people to live there. We can't use all of our space. We would have to spend extra money to be able to use all of our space, to convert it into a 3-flat, and then we could still only have 9 people. So we cannot use our space the way we need to. And believe me, the guys, men and women, that are living at that facility called Our House have formed a family. But the definition is completely irrelevant to their living situation. I think their living situation in some ways created that family. So prohibiting it would have been a real detriment. I would also like to add that anecdotally, the ordinance as it stands right now on the street, the word is that it is enforced inequitably. And that's in large part because people don't really know when this kind of doubling up is happening. And it usually gets reported by a neighbor or somebody who doesn't want to see that happen. And that happens inequitably as well. So if you have a Hispanic family that has another family move in with them because they ran out of money and couldn't afford their own place, and the neighbor doesn't like it, that's when it gets reported. And so, it happens with students a lot too. But honestly, it is the 50% of households that are struggling that really need more flexibility in how we use the buildings that we have. We don't have the time and we don't have the money to build all of the affordable housing that we need. We have to use the structures that we have in place to do it. And the ordinance as it stands right now prohibits that. And so Joining Forces very strongly recommends that we, one, eliminate all use of the term family. I can give you examples of new families that have been created among homeless people that are not related by blood or marriage. So one, that we get rid of that. And two, that we develop a standard for occupancy that allows us to use our buildings in as flexible a way as possible. Thank you.
There was one other person who signed up, Bonnie Wilson.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Hi. Can I have a video or video? Let's start a video. I have the video or you have to do it. I'd rather see people when they see me. Hi. I'm Bonnie Wilson. Come on here. I'm Bonnie Wilson. I've been a real estate agent in Evanston for over 35 years and working on affordable housing issues with Joining Forces. However, tonight I want to talk to you about, I'm a member of the North Shore Board of Realtors, the local government affairs committee. And the director, John Roth, made a suggestion to me that maybe we should look at the village of Gurnee, who has a different definition, alternate definition of a municipal code called the single housekeeping unit. And I want to read this to you. The single housekeeping unit is any household whose members are an interactive group of persons jointly occupying a dwelling unit, including joint access to and use of all common areas, including living, kitchen, and eating areas within the dwelling unit, and sharing household activities and responsibilities such as meals, chores, expenses, and maintenance, and whose makeup is not determined by the members, whose makeup is determined by the members of the unit, rather than by the landlord, property manager, or other third party. So if you understand that, it's not a family. I mean, we're not saying the word family anymore. It's what their definition, they're all living together. They all have the same responsibilities together of cooking and being together, but we're not saying who's related to who. I don't know if that helps you, but it's a different way to look at it. Thank you. Does that help? I don't know.
Yes, actually. Thank you, Bonnie.
Yeah, I think that was it for whoever actually signed up, but
Is there anyone?
if there's anyone else who wishes to speak or say anything.
Okay.
Seem like it.
Well, I'd like to ask, I'd like to kind of go back to, I understand the notion of the using the unit size, but I'm still kind of hung up on the issue of the owner occupied dwelling units and how you would enforce occupancy standards after, because usually by the time you get the house sold, and like if it's on issuance of transfers tax where the house has already been sold, and it turns out that for whatever reason the house is too small for the number of occupants. I mean, how are you going to address that from a property standards kind of way? I mean, I'm
Right. So, usually with a household like that, owner occupied that's way overcrowded, you would get a complaint, I think, from a neighbor or something like that. That's how it would come to our attention. And I mean, if we inspected it and it was dangerously overcrowded, then of course you would have to come to some agreement with the family to do something, put on an addition or do something. You couldn't leave a home to be dangerously overoccupied. If it's slightly overoccupied, I'm sure that at that point, if it's, I know we want to get away from the word family, but if it's somebody's children, say for example, somebody has 10 or 12 children and it's not safe for that many children, we would have to visit that, because that happens a lot, like even in apartments. Like when I worked in the city of Chicago, you would have an apartment maybe with 2 bedrooms and there would be, 10 or 12 children in there. It wouldn't be safe. You also have the example of the coach house fire in Chicago, where 10 children were in that coach house and horribly there was a fire, right? So there are dangerous over occupancies of family units that have to be addressed by property standards that come up. So that can be worked out by, maybe an addition to the home or trying to figure out something with them. So that's, I think, how you would handle a single family owner occupied overcrowding situation. And Angel can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's how I would see that would be a very difficult, situation that you would have to handle with some aplomb, I think. Right, Angel?
Yeah, Judy, I think you're right. I think if we had a single family home that was owner occupied, like they were the owners, they weren't renting, and we found by virtue of a complaint that it was grossly over occupied and it was no longer safe, we would have to work with the individual family to come up with something that would bring them into compliance and make the property safe, because there's no one way to solve that. We don't know how big the property is. We don't know, can they add on? Do they have the ability to sell? We don't know. In the event that a family is renting a unit, whether it's a single family home or whether it's an apartment, and we find that it's overoccupied, we work with the family and the landlord we don't want to kick anybody out. We don't want anybody homeless. We don't want a family homeless. So we work with the owner to make sure that they're aware that when this lease comes up for renewal, they need to consider the occupant load of the structure before they make that decision again. In terms of a property for sale, transfer stamps are requested typically before the property transfers. And so we could get an occupant load and provide that to the seller, who has to provide it to the buyer. So they're aware when they're walking into this, what those requirements are. In some cases, it doesn't make a difference to people. They're going to do what they want to do, and property standards would have to respond when we get a complaint. In other instances, they may say, you know what, we don't want to go this way. We want to make sure that we're following the rules. And that particular sale might fall through. We don't have any control over that. But it would be our responsibility to provide that information up front so that the family can make that decision together.
How many home sales do we have every year? Just
A lot.
I'm trying to figure out how big this potential issue is. I mean, you've got we've got, again, for the sake of argument, we've got 28,000 housing units. I think there are probably a few more than that, but you've got, a certain percent, 45% are rental, and it's 50-50 roughly, I think.
I think on an average week, we're probably responding to 20-25 transfer stamp requests. Average. Does that mean every transfer stamp request results in a sale? Not always. Some of them fall through for whatever reason, but we're responding to 20-25 transfer stamp requests a week.
But so you'd have to have the 25, until you had every, the data on every dwelling unit in Evanston, you'd have to go through that. And then, with the rentals, those renew, not necessarily every year, but you've got an awful lot of rentals. I'm trying to figure out how this would be even phased in.
So calculating the occupant load itself is not difficult. I mean, it's a fairly simple process. It's doing the math of the rooms, the bedrooms, and then doing the math in terms of the living room, dining room space. We would just have to change our policy to request a floor plan with room size measurements when transfer stamps are requested, and we can calculate the occupant load that way. I mean, it's not terribly difficult to do. We already do that with new rentals. They have to supply us the floor plan whenever they're registering a new rental. And when we go in to do these complaint inspections, we're measuring. So if we didn't have to measure, we already had that information, it would save time. Another thing to consider is we have floor plans then if police or fire need them, but.
Yeah, so how many do you have now in your system?
Registered, you mean in terms of occupant load?
Yeah.
All the new ones that we've gotten over the last, what, Sarah, has it been like a year and a half since we changed the rental ordinance? And we've gotten several. I would guess probably upwards of what, 30, 40 in the last year and a half at least, new rentals. And then whenever we do a complaint inspection, we measure the rooms and calculate the occupant load. So out of the last couple of complaints that we've gotten, we've added about 4 or 5 more to that list.
Okay.
It's not a lot. We need more. We definitely need more.
Say, if you've got say 13 or 14,000 rental units, now I understand you've got similar floor plan. I mean, that's a lot of implementation if you're really going to try to enforce the standards.
It's upfront implementation though, because in most cases the floor plans don't change. People are not doing most people are not doing major construction, and if they are, they're getting a permit, and we then have the change to the floor plan on file that way. So once we get the information and we have it, it's good to go. It's just getting that information up front that would be
and that's kind of one of the logistical things that gives me a bit of pause on completely changing, eliminating the family definition, or completely eliminating the family definition, or and I think that it would be useful to have some, and maybe the research piece is to kind of do some well, there are rental houses around the university, maybe looking at those and saying, what would the property standards occupancy allow? I think that would be a useful piece of information to have for purposes of this discussion.
For the properties that we've seen already, it varies significantly. I mean, there are some units that are really, really large, very large units where you could have, 8, 10 people. And then there are other units where it's just a small, rental apartment and you have like 3 or 4. And that's the maximum occupant load. You might be able to put 6 people in the bedrooms because the bedrooms are big enough. But then when you calculate the living room, dining room space, you can only have, 4 people. You can't have 6 because you don't have enough combined space, even though the bedrooms are big enough. So it varies so much.
Yeah, well, but I think my point is, I mean, this is a fairly significant change in how we do things. And I think that in order to understand what the implications are, we really need to know, what it would mean for, particular, be it the, some of the bigger houses around the university. And I think that the point that Sue raised about the families doubling up and, how, there are certain situations where, you may have families doubling up and the house is perfectly fine. It can accommodate that. And other situations where it wouldn't meet the occupancy standards. So how is that? And I can understand that, there's certain that can't be kind of, how would you deal with that uniformly across the board?
In terms of over occupancy in any unit?
Yeah. I mean, if we don't have a family definition, you've got the families doubling up due to
it would be enforced based on the square footage. I mean, if the unit is big enough to safely house 6 people, you could have 6 people there. If we get a complaint and we do an inspection and you have 8, then we need to address it with the owner. We need to figure out a way to make that unit code compliant. But it's based on the life safety then. It's not based on anybody's definition or interpretation of a family. It's strictly based on the safety of the structure. Can the toilet flushes and can the showers and can the sinks, can it hold, and support all of that activity? Do the exits support enough exits in the event of an emergency for 8 people getting out of the unit? that's what we look at. And that's what the square footage and the life safety aspect would address, as opposed to a family.
Which you're doing now. I mean,
We
that's-
do. We do that now, yes. But then we also, after we calculate the square footage, have to determine, is it overoccupied by the definition of family? So we look at the square footage first, because then we know that it's safe and it can house these people. But then we have to look at the zoning definition of family and determine whether it's overoccupied by that means.
Okay, so any commissioners, do you have anything else to add or questions at this point?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Chair, I just
Elizabeth.
wanted to make a couple points. Bonnie had put some information into the chat for us about, in response to questions. So I'm going to read from that. In the past, and thank you, Bonnie, in the past year, there were 548 closed homes, and 545 condo closings, and there were 656 rentals. That's what Bonnie put into the chat. Thank you, Bonnie. One of the things I also wanted to point out is, in any situation where you change a system or establish a system, there kind of has to be a phase-in period. And in addition to complaint inspections, we also have routine inspections. And so one of the things that could be done as a part of the routine inspections process is, you could say, part of what we're now doing is when we come for this routine inspection, we need to have the floor plans and the dimensions of all your dwelling units. So there could be processes that will put it into place. Can I say we could do it all in 1 year? No, I don't think anyone can make this kind of a change in 1 year. But I think that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to figure out a way to get the information that can lead us to maintaining better health and safety regulations about occupancy in our homes and apartments. So I honestly do think I appreciate your point that it is a massive job, but I think there are ways it can be phased in and done. And of course, when you have complaint properties, then of course that can be looked at the time, and you can say, okay, now we do have to make sure what the occupancy should be based on this. And that gives property standards then that to work with right then, as opposed to saying, well, we're still looking at the family structure. And if they have that, because we don't really have anything that, it's difficult right now. We have a definition in our zoning of who can occupy a unit, which doesn't have the same relationship to the size and configuration of the unit. And arguably, I think we could even come into a situation where those two codes are not in sync, and then I don't know how you enforce them, which is a potential other problem.
Well, and we have another agenda item, so I don't want to kind of keep this going for too long, but I would like, I suggest, I think we need to continue this discussion. What I would like to see is some examples of, some of the what the occupancy standards would actually mean, with some real life examples. Maybe a couple of the rental bigger houses around campus, maybe some of the situations where units are being doubled up, perhaps Sue's 2-flat example that she mentioned. I think that it's really important for in determining whether a change like this ought to be made. I think that both the public and ultimately, when the plan commission and when it gets to council, back to council one way or another, we need to understand what the real life implications are of this change. So I don't know that you need to do all the work, all 28,000 units, but I think that I think we need to understand how this would play out. And
Commissioner Linwell?
What?
Commissioner Linwell, one question that I have is the current, I guess, like proposal that the occupancy standards these, the new definition, the new way of addressing this, would that be part of the zoning ordinance, or would that be part of the, another part of the code that's not within our purview?
I don't know the answer to that. And I think we need to have some sort of a definition that relates to occupancy of residential units, be it the gurney kind of example, or a modification of the definition that we have in our current ordinance.
Mhm.
So there's that sort of situation. But whether or not the enforcement of occupancy rules belongs in the zoning ordinance or not, I think I think that question is still open.
Mhm.
And that's kind of why I want to see, I think in our discussion, we ought to understand what the implications are, and what so we can make a determination as to what direction is the best way to go.
Understood.
I mean, I know you're leaning toward getting rid of it, and I'm leaning toward keeping it. And I don't know where Chris is, but but I think that we need more information. And I think we need more discussion as to what, going back to what is the issue we're really trying to solve.
I think we can do some examples and then perhaps maybe mock something up to see what it may look like within the code. I mean, if we do end up going the route of eliminating things from the zoning code, we do have instances where, just for the sake of someone who may be looking up other zoning information, we can mention it and then point to someplace else within the city code where the full regulations exist. And that's done on a pretty regular basis, and that's usually even linked, and someone can click on that link and directly go to that section. So there are ways to do it where if it's not fully listed in the zoning code, we can point to where it is fully listed so someone can fairly easily get to it.
Thank you. And along those lines, besides the examples, I think it would be helpful to get a listing of where the family appears in our zoning ordinance now. Because one of the suggestions was you'd have to, eliminate the reference to family. And I think that it would be important for our discussion moving forward to, know where those references sit. And what would have to be changed. Anyone else?
You got it.
Okay. All right, so I guess the next item on our agenda is a discussion of the text amendment. So for the wireless facilities. Megan, do you want to get us started on that?
This is a fairly short presentation for this one. Real quick. As a quick background, this is coming about largely from the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which is absolutely some time ago. And that established some standards and placed limits on regulations that state and our local authorities were able to put in place with regards to telecommunication services. And that relates to the placement, construction, modification, and the actual review process for those facilities. And some of the key takeaways within that act were placing a required time frame for the review process, which is 150 days for a new facility and 60 days for a co-location of wireless services. And I think that was recently reduced from 90 days. procedural safeguards on the placement, construction, and modification location of these facilities. And then in the event of a denial of an application, requiring written reasons for denial of an application with substantial evidence supporting that denial. On a slightly more local level, in 2018, the Illinois passed Illinois Small Wireless Facilities Deployment Act, and these led to some revised regulations within Title VII, which is for public ways, which address the application process for and the placement of small wireless facilities within the public right-of-way, so not on private property. As it stands right now, there are currently no regulations within Title VI zoning that actually relates to these structures and their use. As was laid out in the staff report, we began to look at some regulations that speak to the location of these facilities on private property and the process for that. And some of the things we want to go over, discuss, and see where your thoughts are as for permitting these by right or as a special use in each zoning district, clarifying a SIT review process, limiting new tower or support structure height to the maximum height allowed for structures in that underlying zoning district. And if it does not follow that maximum height, a special use to be required. Specifying setbacks and locations on these private lots, and then also allowing for adjustments to existing non-conforming wireless facilities, as long as that non-conformity is not expanded. So that's actually the end of that presentation. If you want to go to some specific regulations, I can pull up the actual packet and we can go to some sections there.
Okay. I just want to kind of kick this off by clarifying that we're really talking about making sure that we've got broadband connections and that the facilities don't necessarily have to be limited to the public utility poles and the public right of way, essentially. Is that?
That's correct. I think in a lot of cases, that's probably where they are located, just because it's probably the ease of location and not having to spend money on a new structure, monopole, or dealing with other entitlement processes for using private property. But the goal really is, especially I think with the 2018 regulations, to expand that broadband service, and specifically like the 5G that's been rolled out recently.
Do we have any information on what kind of coverage gaps there are in Evanston now? Just, or if there are any?
That I do not. That's actually a good question.
I just,
I
because
can see if that's something we can.
fine. I mean, and again, technology is changing all the time anyway. Because
Yes.
the first question is, whether it should be permitted by right or as a special use in all of the zoning districts. I think the examples you had, that they were generally limited to just commercial and industrial districts. But the question is, whether or not does it make sense to include other zoning districts, maybe, some of the university districts or some of the higher density residential districts are there. And I think it's kind of a question, that we need to discuss. So commissioners, thoughts?
Well,
I would say that was be my first question is, do we want to permit by right? Do they need to be allowed in every district? I guess my other question is in terms of height, again, do you really want to tie it into the height per district, or do you want to tie the height into what's actually needed for coverage in that particular area? So I think there's some questions there about, how broad you want to make it in terms of adding these facilities.
Although I think that if I read the suggestion, if the height, if the height was higher than that allowed in the base zoning district, it could go through a special use process. Would that be the thought?
Sure,
Correct.
but
So-
you may, but the question is why you really need necessarily to tie it into the height of a building, let's say, or whether there is some other way to do it, depending on what's needed. That's all.
Yeah, I think that may be difficult, at least on zoning's end. That would we definitely have to tie in like Public Works and get documentation on the coverage in that regard. I mean, my guess is that it would be easier and reception would probably be better if you go higher and there's less that could possibly get in the way of a signal or something along those lines. But that is something to consider.
Yeah.
And then Megan, the other question is, are we thinking of towers at this point? Or are you thinking more of smaller facilities that would be mounted on rooftops, let's say, or roof decks and things like that nature?
Really both, because there are some cases where we have providers who want to put an antenna on top of a building or on top of an existing structure. I don't know that we have too many instances of new like monopoles or anything like that. In recent times, it's largely been co-location that I'm aware of. But it really is trying to speak to a little bit of everything. And to be sure, with the FCC and the state regulations, we can only take the restrictions so far. And I did it. I don't think it was within the report where I did talk with the building manager, and he mentioned that if we do deny an application, that we do have to have an alternative site within 100 feet of what was proposed.
minor
Yeah.
constraint.
Yeah, so there are definitely limits to how far we can go with regards to regulations for these.
I would think that would argue to to making and again, a permitted use would be something that staff can approve, and a special use would go to the ZBA, correct? On this?
Right. And for this one, I'm thinking it would be something that would be the zoning, the ZBA would be the final decision on that.
So if we make the height too low, you're and you need to have height, then you're increasing potentially the work for them.
Understood.
Right.
And so Megan, you had said that we're not sure how many wireless facility, like how many of these, each type of these 3 facilities there are in the city, and what districts or in what districts they're located thus far.
Yeah, I asked about that as well. We have started to keep track of the small wireless facilities, and we still haven't gotten very many that I've seen. A little bit of a ways I was able to go back into our records. But we don't, from what I've seen, have documentation of like actual towers or monopoles, if there are any.
Mm-hmm. Well, these small wireless facilities, I think they're less than 25. Well, that's less than 25 cubic feet. What's the name of the other one that's really micro wireless?
Micro.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what, like, are there any micro wireless facilities in the city?
I don't know that we've gotten micro facilities.
Because those seem to be, like, just based on the size, those seem to be the kind of things that you could put, like, 100 of them, every other block, right? And so, you know, that would definitely be something that would probably, that someone would want to put in, let's say, residential districts, because they're not meant to, you know, they're not meant to have a wide range. The only question I have is that if we allow them in residential districts, it's quite likely that the wireless provider is going to contract with either AT&T or ComEd, whoever owns utility poles in the area, and we'll try to just, you know, piggyback off of that easement. And the easements that exist for those poles are usually written very broadly. I'm not sure that wireless would be is included in that definition, but I'm fairly certain that they'll be able to do it. I mean, they'll be able to, you know, wiggle that in. And so if we allow these, you know, facilities to be located in residential districts, I don't think you're going to be getting applications from the property owner, or even any kind of consent from the property owner. I think what you're going to end up seeing is that ComEd's just going to come in and, you know, ComEd or AT&T, and they're going to say, we're putting it right here, and we have an easement on an existing pole, and it's going in, right? And
Yeah, I mean, as it
maybe
is
that's
now,
just
if
the way it
we,
needs to be, but like I think that's where it's going to go on those.
yeah, I mean, as it is now, when we do get applications, I mean, right now zoning is kind of like the courtesy review, with it being dealing with the public way. But if there is an application where there is a need to locate on some type of private property, we need to have some proof that that owner is okay with that. So I mean, the same would go if someone is looking to locate on a lot or on a larger apartment building and put an antenna at the top of that, or things of that nature. We would want to see some type of letter of agreement or something that's signed off on.
What about the one page? What about the one page, you know, blanket easement that you know, ComEd and AT&T throw at homeowners? I mean, are you actually looking for like a specific consent for this facility, or with respect to this facility, or if you know, wireless company comes in with an easement and says we're locating it in this easement, and here the easement says it's okay, don't talk to the property owner, like, but I mean, like, you know, they potentially have the legal right to that, but what you're saying is, at this point, your review requires that you speak to like, you get something, informed consent from the property owner for this specific facility.
Right. As of now, that's the way that's set up.
Okay.
I've got a question as to whether or not we're talking about a use as a principal use, or is this an accessory use, particularly if you're going to locate something on, you know, on the top of an apartment building?
For most of these, I'm thinking it would be an accessory use. For it to be a principal use, I don't know that we have many lots that this would end up being the only thing on it, but it's definitely possible, especially if it's like a ground unit, or it's something that's larger, that's got
Or we've got all those
a power box or something associated with it.
we have all those substandard lots that we are now putting efficiency homes on.
Right, exactly. But I mean, in the case of it being something that's more of a principal use, I mean, that could be something that's looked at by our DAPR committee, Design and Project Review, to make sure that, landscaping and layout and things of that nature are as small a issue for neighboring properties as possible.
I guess I'm trying to, because our goal here is, or the request really is to look at how it would be incorporated into the zoning ordinance. So there's the question of which districts it should be allowed in, which gets into the, what kind of coverage gaps are there. And then B, we've got, this question is it a principal use or a accessory use? And I don't know if would the standards be the same for one or the other? I mean, how many situations on private property are we likely to be dealing with? Because I would agree with Peter that they're most likely going to go on some utility pole, even in a residential neighborhood.
Yeah, more than likely, we wouldn't see that many. And talking briefly, our building permit manager, he said we tend not to get very many reviews just in general, and that's more dealing with the public way right now. And part of that is because of the way the FCC and the state kind of laid out the rules to try to make it as easy as possible for some of these to get through. But again, just in general, it seems like in a lot of cases, it's more of a co-location kind of deal. You wouldn't expect to see many new towers or poles going up around the city.
So I have a question as it relates to the zoning and locating these facilities on the right of way. Doesn't the zoning go to like the center of the street? Right? So like aren't these properties already being located in zoning districts? That it's not, they're not on private property, but they're being located in zoning districts, even though they're in the right of way.
Now, I think the regulations that would, zoning just pertains to private property. So I think that, right?
Generally, when we're looking at zoning, it's for the private property.
I mean, weren't we talking about changing the zoning for the Civic Center to allow for some other use? I mean, it's right. It's a defined lot, but I mean, the city owns the right of way, right? And the city owns lots as well. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is, we're sort of already, like what we've already done is is going to, I think, inform what we're going to do next. But I think, if there could already be towers in residential districts if we consider that the zoning goes to the middle of the street, or the middle of the alley, which I think is how it's looked at.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Like a utility pole right outside my house is located in an R3 district because I'm in an R3 district and my zoning goes to the middle of the street. And so if we don't allow certain towers in residential districts in the zoning code, that would be now a non-conforming.
Okay, got it.
Already there,
So you'd have to allow them. So, but
I didn't want to overcomplicate. Let's just like keep that in the back of our mind as we.
Yeah, no, I think that's
that raises a valid point, because you would technically, just a matter of maybe 5 feet, have an existing monopole or structure or antenna, but then because it gets onto private property, then it's not allowed in that zoning district, even though it's 5 feet away in the alley. So that raises an interesting point.
Well, I mean, what I'm saying is that what the city's willing to do in the right of way should match what we're willing to do on private property, because the right of way also has zoning. The right of way is not free of zoning. It has zoning.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Folks, I apologize. I have to leave. Sorry to have to sign off.
No problem.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry.
Here.
No problem. Thanks.
Okay, but the right-of-way regulations we have don't apply to private property, correct?
Correct.
Be it a city, be it the civic center lot or my house.
Correct. If it's in the right of way, that's basically the city's purview or public works purview.
But would we need to have, you've got regulations for what happens if it's in the public right of way. Why would the regulations need to match what happens on your property or my property?
And to a certain extent, the way they are drafted now, they do kind of match. And I think that is more so because of how limitations are placed by the FCC and the state regulations. It's laying out what we can and can't do to a certain extent, but realizing that there are some differences in how you deal with the public right of way versus someone's private property, be it next to a university building or someone's single family home or
Sherman Plaza.
right.
So you're saying the FCC's regulations tie the city's hands and basically require the city to approve the installation of some of these facilities within 100 feet of the requested spot in the public right of way.
I have to say, I think it's the state that caused that regulation to be put in place.
Okay.
Both of the federal and the state regulations are more guidelines to keep the localities from becoming too restrictive.
Okay.
That's essentially what they lay out.
And do you know if those like, I guess, restrictions against placing restrictions, do those apply to non right of way locations? Do those apply to lots as well, whether publicly or privately owned?
There are some regulations for how far we can limit the location. I don't have the language right in front of me to be able to see exactly what they are, be able to recite them.
Okay.
I can definitely find those and pull them up though.
I mean, maybe just send them along. Send them to the committee. I don't think this is anything we're gonna
Solve tonight?
We're gonna solve tonight.
No, I don't think so. I don't think that was the intent.
Yeah, as long as we start the discussion and get a good ways along, and if there's any just like burning questions or red flags that you guys have that we can address, and I'll see exactly how far we can go.
Mm-hmm.
What's discussed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, making sure we have adequate broadband or allow for broadband connection and whatever the technology is moving forward is obviously a good thing.
Mhm.
But so I think that kind of understanding kind of what the need is, and granted, the need's going to change as technology changes, probably.
Correct.
So what else would, so we've got the question of, is this a principal or an accessory use?
Mhm.
The kind of, should it be, and frankly, I mean, is there any likelihood that really that they're going to want to put start dotting these on the roofs of single family houses in Northwest Evanston? I mean,
It doesn't seem likely, right?
no, I wouldn't think so. I think tall tall multifamily building, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, but I guess the sort of blind spot that I have is the small and the micro wireless facilities. What are their purpose? Like, what do they do? Where are they located? I'm not sure if I've ever seen one, right? Like, I know that the large facilities, like what we know what is as a cellular tower, right? You want to have it on the highest point possible. You want to have as much 360 degrees of like open space around it as possible, so you get the most coverage for it. So they go out looking for the highest spot, and the one that's not encumbered by other buildings around it, so that you get the most coverage, right? And so that makes sense. But like, for something that's only like, I think the micro is 6 cubic feet, right? I mean, that's 3 feet by 2 feet, 3 foot by 2 foot by 1 foot box. I mean, that's very small, and it seems like it's like about the size of a transformer, right, on a utility pole. And like that seems like the kind of thing you could put on every other block.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Again, this is kind of not my area of expertise. I know that ComEd, when they were trying to do their, improve their reliability and stuff, they mounted antennas on top of some of their utility poles. I have one in my alley, and when they're in the summer, when there are trees, you don't notice it. In the winter, you kind of look at it and you go, boy, that's tall. But again, I haven't had a power outage in a long time. So, the technology is good. But
It might be helpful, Megan, to invite someone from Public Works to the next meeting to help us understand, or get someone to help us understand what these facilities are used for, where they want to be located, just so we have a understanding of the
Yeah,
layout.
I can
maybe
see
what
if
they
there's
look
something I
like,
can pull up.
like a
Yeah,
picture
pictures.
of what one of these things is.
Right, because it a lot of cases, especially for the smaller ones, especially if they're located in the right of way, they probably are on these utility poles that are sprinkled within the residential districts already. But I can definitely see if there's, maybe if not specs, or just some examples or a quick description of what other facilities are used for, and kind of how broad their stretch is.
Yeah, and maybe even kind of the emerging technologies, so, because it's one thing to create regulations for what exists right now, but if we're going to do this, we might as well be proactive and looking kind of toward what's coming. So we understand.
Okay.
It seems to me there's a big difference between, an antenna that gets put on the roof of a building. I mean, I could see weather vane, kind of, I can imagine, or some of the examples in the article you sent with the church, the cross in front of a church. So these can be camouflaged a lot of different ways, but.
Okay, yeah,
I think that would be helpful.
more examples. And then we want to bring this back to the committee or to the full commission?
I leave that up to you, Commissioner Lindwall. I'm only on the board for another 7 weeks.
I think that probably if we're going to struggle with this, we probably ought to do it as a full commission. Seems to me, but I think that the questions really, I think we've got to have some clarity on what these things might look like. If it's going to be a principal use with a tower, some sort of a support structure, I could see that being maybe a special use, anywhere, because you'd want to have some control over maybe the design, maybe not, and I don't object to the building height suggestion, but if it's an accessory use, we ought to kind of have some understanding of where these might be located. So I think just some more information and frankly, a picture of what they would look like, so you know what you're talking about. It's kind of hard to imagine what we're talking about reading the definitions.
No, that makes sense. And then I guess we can then speak more to the other part of the process, like if it's not as a special use with the review by Dapper, what they'd be looking at, or if there's some kind of change, if you want Dapper to kind of be the group that looks at it and makes the final decision.
Can they, if it's a special use, they can't, can they?
Well, if it's going to be a special use, then they make a recommendation
To the ZBA.
Right. But Dapper can definitely take a look at if there's landscaping, if it's going to be on top of a building, like what it's going to look like, how it's mounted, and things of that nature.
Yeah, I think that understanding kind of, what you'd be asking, what you'd be asking the ZBA to actually rule on, and what would be, what situations. I could see, like, if it's, exceeds the building height allowed in the underlying district, for example, might be something. But I think you'd want to limit how much technical review you're asking your boards.
Oh, absolutely.
To do.
Absolutely.
We're such experts here.
Yeah, I think from a zoning perspective, it's more about kind of the way we look at a structure with like bulk regulations, where it is on a lot, how tall is it, how far setback is it from something else, or something of that nature.
Yeah, and the other question I had, and just looking through, there was a description of fencing. I can't remember.
I think if the height,
Oh yeah, it was
like if it's
it was the appearance. A facility must be completely enclosed by a solid fence or wall, a minimum of 6 feet and a maximum of 8 feet in height. It was on your memo on page 6. I just was, kind of going, do we always want to have them screened with a fence? Probably for safety.
yeah, that could probably depend on what type of facility it is. Like if there's going to be a tower and maybe some kind of
Yeah, I think it was kind
that
of
you'd want to screen it from the public being able to have access.
Yeah, it was just
That antenna on
the
something.
appearance standards.
Yeah.
Oh, actually, it was under the wireless support structures. So it would be like the tower.
Right.
So,
Speaks to whether it's the 6 feet for like a residential or 8 feet if it's in a commercial district.
yeah,
Lines up with our fence heights.
I just had a question. I can't remember quite why I had it, but I did. Okay, does this give you enough to work with?
Yes, it does. And I can bring this back to the commission at some point next month, probably.
Yeah, or whenever you've got, depending on what the agenda, there's no big rush on this one, right?
I don't think so. We definitely want to have some regulations in place, but I don't think it's a huge rush.
Okay. So Peter, you may be around to lead the discussion.
Sounds good.
All right. Are we done?
I think we're done.
All right. Motion
Adjourn.
adjourn. Peter,
Motion.
what?
I said motion, yes.
Oh, second.
All right.
I have
I think we
more
can.
people on this committee. All right. Good night, everyone.
All right, good night.
Night.
Good night.